Right, okay. As far as I'm aware, we are live. So welcome to everyone or anyone who's tuned in. Another Facebook Live Q&A. Tonight, we're really, really lucky to have Brian Etheridge with us joining us from all the way up in Scotland. And we're going to talk about Brian's life monitoring raptors because, yeah, what he doesn't know about monitoring raptors, well, it's not worth listening to. That's what I say. Anyway, thanks, Brian. Thank you for joining us.
Right. Yes, it's a great pleasure to be here, Jimmy. You you look a lot wilder than the last time I saw you 2 years ago.
Yeah, well, it's probably because I haven't shaved since last time you saw.
All right. You probably have a few wrens nesting in that, I imagine.
I think so. Yeah. It's pretty. I think the word my wife uses is feral.
Yeah, feral indeed.
Feral at the moment. So anyway, it's the premise behind this, Brian, is just to give people an opportunity to meet people like yourself. Ruth, obviously, Dr. Ruth Tingley we had on yesterday, who do so much for raptors in the UK, and we've had people from all over the world. So yeah, it's a bit of a window into your world really, and monitoring raptors. I'll let you into the nickname that I've got for you at the end of it. I won't tell it you now. But
right, okay.
There's certain people that I meet in life that I work with raptors. And I give them the special ones get a nickname. So I'll tell you if you remind me at the end. I'll tell you what yours is, but I won't do it now because you might laugh at me. So anyway, let's start with always the same. Is at the beginning. How did you? What's your first memory of birds of prey and watching birds of prey and thinking, yeah, this is for me.
Right. So really, my birding life came from my father. And really the first memory was when I was about 10 or 11. But my first experience of a raptor was a sparrowhawk, which I found nailed to a hut in a wood on a heap of ground, in Northumberland. So that was my first raptor, which I sort of removed and cut its wing off and got its skull. And, so that was really the start. And I grew up in Northumberland, which was at the time, there was quite a hotbed of young, teenage birders, And at that time in the early 60s, raptors were very scarce. And so they had a special attraction, and in Northumberland, all we had really were merlins and kestrels. There were no, sparrowhawks were extremely rare. There were no peregrines, they'd gone. But there were no buzzards, nothing else, And so, of course, for kestrels were everywhere, but merlins we had to go up on the moors. And so that was really my first live experience, was looking at merlins with a group of pals. We used to cycle out from Newcastle, where I was brought up, and go out mainly on the Simonside Hills near Rothbury. That's where we used to go and look at merlins.
Okay.
That was in sort of cycling distance, about a couple of hours on our bicycles. And really, it wasn't until I sort of, late in my teens, I joined the RAF, got an engineering post in the RAF when I was 19. And I was posted then, my first posting was to the north of Scotland, really only 30 miles from where I'm sitting now.
Yeah.
And this was my first visit to Scotland. And then I started seeing birds of prey, buzzards and kestrels and sparrowhawks, and I was eventually posted away. I did a few years up in the north of Scotland, but I had a really great posting away to Gibraltar.
Okay, so, yeah.
And that really got me going, because Gibraltar at that time in the early 70s was just amazing for the passage of raptors, birds of prey. All sorts, not in single figures, in the hundreds, if not thousands, So I was out in Gibraltar for 3 years, came back in the mid 70s, and one of my best mates from my teenage years, one of my Northumbrian birding pals, chap called Mick Marquis, and he was working with Ian Newton studying sparrowhawks at the time in down in Dumfriesshire. So Mick came up and joined me for a long weekend, you know, where I was based, really just in Murrayshire, across near Forest. And he said it's a great place for raptors. This, you've got all this, you know, Scots pine. And so he took me out and got me started on looking for sparrowhawk nests, you know. And so with his encouragement, it really sort of off I went, you know. And so that became an absolute obsession. I was still working in the RAF as an engineer, but in all my free time I spent looking for sparrowhawks. But when you're searching woodland, you find not only sparrowhawks, but you find other species, you know, you find buzzards. And so I've got a sort of small population of buzzards to monitor as well.
Yeah.
And then I started going back on the moors again to look for merlins. And of course, then I came across hen harriers. And, you know, my first hen harrier nest was a brood of young exploding out of the nest as I walked in on it, you know, well-feathered chicks, you know. Yep. So that's really how it really kicked off. And so eventually the sparrowhawk study ran for 13 years, and I fed all my information to Ian Newton, and he incorporated quite a lot of it in his book, The Sparrowhawk.
Yeah.
And the buzzard study, a colleague up here, friend up here in the birding world was Bob Swan. He was looking at buzzards over at Drumnah Drocket down Loch Ness side. And of course, I was looking at a different population in farmland and forestry just around on the Murray Plain, you know. So we looked at our data and we looked at prey species. And so Bob put together a paper looking at how the prey varied between these two places. One where rabbits were very important, which was the Murray study, and he had no rabbits, and so his buzzards were just feeding off mainly passerines. And so his buzzards were producing sort of 1 or 2 young, and mine were producing 3 or 4, you know.
Yeah, yeah.
He wasn't suffering persecution, but I was suffering quite severe persecution, despite, you know, all the monitoring I was doing. The ones in state forests were okay, but the ones in private forestry were just getting hammered, you know. Anyhow, eventually my life in the RAF came to an end in the mid-80s, and I was just obsessed with birds of prey, and during that time I got to know Roy Dennis very well, who was at the time the Highland officer for the RSPB, and he just said, when you leave the RAF, just come and have a word with me and see if we can find you a job, you know. You might, you know, you never know, we might have something for you. And it's just no job interview at all, you know. So I just said, Roy, I'm coming out in, you know, a month's time or 6 weeks' time or something like that, you know. And by now I was 40 years old, you know, and I didn't want to go into the normal process of when you leave the forces, you follow the trade or the job that you're in. So the normal process for aircraft engineers like myself would be to go to an airport, you know, and work at an airport, working on civilian aircraft. I just didn't want that. No, I don't know. I wanted to be working on birds, you know, and the idea of being paid to do that. And luckily for me, Roy said, yeah, there's a job coming up. It's looking up doing moorland survey work and so he said it'd be just ideal for you. So and the guy who gave me that first interview for that job was a chap called Mark Avery.
Really? Right, okay.
Yeah, I know. So it was just there was me and one other chap walking these transect along forest. But they want to look at the impact of forestry on bird species, you know. So
Yeah.
particularly the effect of edge, because the theory being that along the forest edge, there were predators like hoodie crows and foxes, and they're having an impact out onto the moorland, you know, affecting wader species and other things, you know. So I had the idea we had to walk these transects at 500-meter distance. Each had to be 4 kilometers long, and we had to do 4 a day.
Wow.
And you couldn't do the next adjacent one, so you had to sort of walk your 4 kilometers, then you had to walk another kilometer to join the next but one transect and go along that. And then, you know, so it ended up doing something like 20 kilometers a day for 5 days a week. I've never been so fit. You know, I think the first day it took me about 8 hours to do my 4 transects, you know, but by the end of the summer, I could do it in about 4.5 hours, you know. Anyhow, that was very useful. I only did 1 season, and it was a short contract. So I came out of that. But they said, look, just hang around a bit. There may be another contract coming up. And sure enough, within a couple of months, they were looking for somebody to organize a hen harrier survey, the very first one. So this was beginning of '88. So I went for the interview with that, along with quite a few other people. But amazingly, I got the job. I think it's because I was the only one there who'd ever been to a hen harrier nest, which was my experience of hen harriers was relatively limited to the ones I saw on migration in Gibraltar, and maybe it's about half a dozen nests I'd found when I was doing my sparrowhawk study, you know, back in Mauritius.
Yeah.
And anyhow, I got the job, and that was me hooked. I mean, I was fairly well hooked on raptors. Well, I was obsessed with the darn things. If you ask my wife, she says you're just obsessed with birds. Anyhow, but now I was absolutely obsessed with this beautiful raptor, you know, the hen harrier. And I still am obsessed with it, you know.
Well, I was going to ask just quickly, roughly what year was that then? Because obviously you said you still
that was '88. That was, I can remember years.
Sorry, yeah, '88.
So the first survey lasted 2 years. It was '88 and '89. That was organised by the RSPB. So I was made the sort of leader of a team of people who were doing it. So there were full paid jobs, well, contract workers doing 3 or 4 months, scattered all over Scotland, and they concentrated purely in Scotland because the population, they thought in England so small that we can just get, you know, local guys to do it, you know.
Yeah.
And so, but the other people we used were the raptor study groups. We were just emerging at that time. So I think there was about 4 regional raptor study groups in Scotland in the late '80s. So I thought, you know, we should use the expertise of these guys, you know. So the 1988 and 1989 was were the survey years, and that was eventually written up. But one of the factors to come out of that was the poor breeding success of hen harriers that were nesting on grouse moors. But let me say now that at that time, about 40% of the population we found were breeding on driven grouse moors. So that's way back, you know, that was, you know, in the late '80s.
Yeah.
That's quite a large number. But I mean, they were suffering quite a high level of persecution. And that really triggered the RSPB to say, well, we need to look at that a bit more, because they were concerned about, I think we found about 500 odd pairs in Scotland, but they wanted to look at the impact of this persecution, you know, in a bit more detail. And so actually I just went from the 2 survey years into a new study, working with raptor study groups, and looking specifically at persecution, you know, of hen harriers. And that was just brilliant for me because I got to know lots of really important people in the raptor study groups. I'd go to their meetings. I would find out their hen harrier specialists. I would, spend weekends with them in the field, really pick their brains, get to know everything about them, understand, some of these guys, some of them unfortunately we've now lost, but just brilliant, inspirational guys, working class guys, no degrees amongst them, just, passionate about being out on the hill, passionate about the birds, That persecution study lasted 6 years. So together with, the 2 years organizing the survey, I had 8 years looking at purely at hen harriers, And I look back on that as just some of the best years of my life, just wonderful. I was just out every day, out on the moors, working with guys who shared a similar passion, That was written up, I think about 1997. My supervisors at the time were, it was Rhys Green, who's at Professor Rhys Green now, and Ron Summers, Dr. Ron Summers. So they supervised me. I should say right at the very start, I have no professional qualifications at all in biology or zoology. I'm an aircraft engineer. I tweak engines, jet engines, and that's what I'm qualified to do. I had no further education after 16, so I need that scientific support, and I still need it, to support what I do. I have the keenness and the fieldcraft to go out there and to collect this information, but I need people in the background to do this statistics, and advise me the way it's going. So, so that was written up and published, and it showed really the huge impact that driven grouse moors, but still in the at that time, by 96, it was still a large proportion of the nests. There was about 40% of the nests were on grouse moors, 40% were on unmanaged heather moorland, and about 20% of nests we looked at were in young forestry.
Okay, yeah.
Mainly over in the west, in Argyll.
Yeah.
So again, there was this stark difference between harriers that attempt to nest, but also at the time, I should have mentioned at the very beginning, we introduced wing tagging. So and again, I've got to go back to the raptor study groups down in Strathclyde and South Strathclyde and Dumfries and Galloway, who had started wing tagging in the late 80s, and I really piggybacked on theirs and brought in a greater range of colors and encouraged other people to do it. And so that we're tagging quite large numbers. We tagged something like 1,200 young hen harriers over the 5 or 6 years.
Wow.
And it was looking for these returning birds, and they're looking at their survival, which was so crucial, to understanding what was happening. So,
and can you remember what sort of back then? Roughly what sort of, not, it doesn't have to be specific, exact. What sort of figures were you getting back from it with the wing tags?
Well, we had almost as many sightings of these birds as we marked. Yes, some were multiple sightings. So it looked like first year survival was pretty good, if I remember. It is when they attempt to breed, and most of the persecution was happening in the breeding season. The females were just shot off the nest.
Yeah.
And quite high numbers, but there were still quite high numbers attempting to breed. And I wish I had the paper in front of me, because I frequently have to go back it, because there were so many facts and figures come out. It was the survival of these wing-tagged birds on grouse moors, which is the critical thing. So there was wing-tagged birds breeding on unmanaged moorland, and there was wing-tagged birds breeding on grouse moors. So the critical thing was looking at what happens. So, I mean, there was natural failure. So you get natural failure on unmanaged moorland. And you get natural failure, presumably, on grouse moors. But when there was a failure, and it was always very difficult to determine. You go to the nest and the contents are missing. And so you don't know what the cause is unless there's any other evidence, and it's very rarely you find the evidence. I remember once finding, a shotgun cartridge nearby. Obviously, you'd shot it and he hadn't picked up the spent cartridge, but that was rare. So mainly it was there was no evidence. But when you looked at the return rate, so these females that failed, when you looked at what their survival was to the following year, and the thing with hen harriers, mostly they returned to the place, or roughly to the same area where they bred the previous year. So the ones that failed on unmanaged moorland, 70% of them were seen again the next year and bred again. But on grouse moors, it was something like less than 10%, So basically, these nest failures were associated with the loss of the females. So basically, the females get shot and the contents were being removed. So that was the striking thing, the big difference, and that was quite important. And that's one of the things that, the wing tags told us how valuable they were. They also, of course, gave us lots of other information. Where they go in winter, the migrations. This big shift of young females from the west of Scotland, where they're fairly productive, and they just move east onto the grouse moors in eastern Scotland, and the movement of young males down through Britain, down through the Pennines, and a lot of them going into the continent. That's quite a striking difference. Young males fly south, young females fly east. But at that time, so the study finished in 96, early 96. And we had enough evidence then for the paper to go forward, And at the time I thought, oh, this is a game changer. This will change everything. But what I hadn't reckoned for, at the same time, they'd started up this first Langham study, which is where they were looking at the impact of predatory birds on a grouse moor, So and that was published within a year of our paper on persecution, and that showed, if depending on whose hat you're wearing, you can either say the either damaging effect of having lots of hen harriers or the natural process that happens on a moor when you have large numbers of grouse, running about. And of course, the keepers immediately latched onto this, looked at the negative side of having birds of prey. And that was a game changer, because they don't read, bird study or, journal scientific study. They don't read that stuff. And stuff that highlight the persecution and stuff like that, that stays in scientific journals. It doesn't get pulled out and it doesn't enter shooting dimes or anything like that. But what does is when another scientific study looks at predation effects, that gets, the juicy bits get pulled out that they want to see. And this was, 15 pairs of hen harriers, what happens when, and they stopped the grouse numbers coming back, and basically gamekeepers thrown onto the scrap heap, made redundant, all this sort of stuff. And that was the big change. And suddenly we saw, and I think RSPB took their eye off the ball. They did the study, they published this stuff, and they thought this would be a big change, And it really wasn't, because the people you've got to change is the man on the ground with the gun, the keeper on the ground. He's the one who's got to change. You can say what you don't want to like, but he's there. He's got his finger on the pulse. And if he sees something about hen harriers impacting grouse, he does not want any hen harriers. He doesn't want one pair. He doesn't want to see one bird, So then it changed. Now they were killing hen harriers. They found they could kill them all the year round. You've just got to find out where they're roosting. You can take them out that way. You can go in and lamp them, And then, of course, this idea about getting high numbers of grouse, which was developed down in England, spread to Scotland, And suddenly by the end of the 90s, we had this high intensive grouse moors,
Yeah.
Greater mobility for keepers. They've all got quad bikes, more hill tracks, and absolutely zero tolerance to birds of prey, particularly hen harriers. They hated hen harriers with a vengeance, They just, they called them rats with wings,
Yeah.
No appreciation of the natural world. All they saw was, got to get my grouse numbers back, get my big, have a successful shooting day and get a nice big fat tax-free tip, I'm afraid that's the way they saw it. And that has not changed. So we've now had over 20 years of this high intensity grouse moor with zero tolerance. And what has happened is that whereas back in the early 90s, 40% of the Scottish hen harrier population was breeding on grouse moors, now it is probably 1%, if that. I haven't done the maths, but I 1 or 2 nests a year, probably. It's probably less than that. It's probably 0.2%. And of course, the situation in England is just, it's gone from maybe it's about 15 or 20 pairs to a couple,
Yeah.
And we've been, yes, so nothing's really changed. So anyhow, that's the hen harrier story. But of course, at the end of with 96, it was that they said, well, thanks very much, Brian. So I was working forget what they call now. We used to call it research department at the RSPB. So I was working for them, and there was no job for me because because there was no more Raptor work. But they did suggest if you want more work in RSPB, you should see what there is in the regional budget. So I was working from the office in Inverness at the time. So amazingly, a job came up. They were wanting somebody to coordinate the red kite work. And I thought, it's bird of prey, breeds in woodland, used to woodland, So I shouldn't say this, but I didn't get an interview. I just said, oh yeah, I'm available. I'll do the job. And so I just walked straight into it, Not knowing then that was going to be me for the next 20 years as a red kite officer, But it's, so I should say I was red kite officer, but I was only red kite officer for about 6 months of the year. So for the other 6 months, they always filled me in with other work, so it was the sort of desk work. So in the 1st of April, I'd be out of the office like a shot, and they wouldn't see me until early August. I'd just come back, tanned and hairy in early August, And then I'd just sort of sit in front of the computer, and that was me until the following spring, you know. But there was always lots to do. So Ron Summers was very good. He gave me bits of work to do. I remember one job I looked at was looking at what was it? Oh, it was nightjar pellets and poo.
Oh wow! Yeah.
Dissecting it and looking for different. Or was it nightjar? Might have been something. Might have been something else. I can't remember. But I had a crash course in identifying bits and pieces. You know, that was one of the least exciting bits. You know.
Yeah.
But so it takes us up to about 2003, and in 2002. So things were changing fairly quickly in Scotland, and one of the findings they had this government-funded review on raptors and stuff, and one of the findings was that raptor monitoring was being carried out by a number of organisations in Scotland, but it was poorly coordinated, and a lot of the information was getting lost, and so they wanted to sort of standardise. And so the job was given to SNH to organise that. So again, this was my first interview. I went and applied. They were wanting a raptor monitoring officer. So that's one job I went for, and luckily I got. But of course I was still a red kite officer. So I managed to negotiate a very good deal.
Yeah.
So I managed to persuade the red kite people that they would pay me for 4 months of the year as a red kite officer, and the raptor monitoring would pay me for remaining sort of 8 months of the year as the raptor monitoring officer, which I would only do between sort of August and March, you know. Yeah. And I said, well, on the 1st of April, I'm the red kite officer, and I'm not doing any raptor monitoring stuff, you know.
Yeah.
So that was really good, and it was very acceptable for most. Well, I think for everyone. So yeah. It meant I was available. I went round and met re-met a lot of the guys I knew from the hen harrier work that I'd done, you know, 10 years, 20 years before. And yeah, so that was brilliant. And that was a really good spell as well. So I did 10 years as the RMO, but I could see things were changing. It was, by the way, the RMO post that was hosted initially by SNH, and then it was hosted by RSPB, and then it was hosted by BTO Scotland, you know. Well, finally, it was hosted by BTO Scotland. So, and I could feel things were changing, and they wanted, and I felt I'd given it 10 years. I'd brought a few changes in, but again, I felt it somehow as my lack of scientific knowledge, you know, this lack of formal education I had, I should say, was holding me back. I couldn't do the analysis I wanted to do, and I felt somehow that, and I shouldn't say this, I've got great respect for the BTO. They wouldn't let me say in my annual report what I wanted to say.
Okay.
Because they would say, Brian, we're not a campaigning organization. We just present the results. We don't campaign. And of course, yeah, I wanted to say things that they didn't want me to say. But that's not the only thing. I just felt it's time to retire from that. And by now I was sort of in my mid-60s, you know. So so I did 10 years, 2013, I then stood down from the RMO job, and it passed to Amy, now the current person.
Yeah.
But I stayed on as the red kite officer in a part-time role. Again, just working full-time for the 4 months, you know, the summer months, looking for nests, monitoring nests, liaising with landowners. And effectively, what I should have done was 8 months a year was just laze around and retire, you know, which seems to be reasonable. But of course, I was still the red kite officer, so I was still out there, still looking at red kite. You don't switch off. I mean, raptors are a passion. it's never was an 8 to 5 job. You're always the the red kite officer, so you get phone calls, all hours of the day and night, and or there's a dead kite on the road, or the sun, and off you'd go. Most of the time, luckily, it were cock pheasants, but people drive past and see something bright red in the gutter and think, oh, it's a red kite. So eventually I decided it's just got to stop, and I decided I would. The red kite was a funny job because it was being funded by S&H, with the contract through to RSPB, and they always said we'd fund it until we got to 50 pairs. Well, of course, they reached 50 pairs. It took a long time to get there because they were just getting hammered. I mean, they were getting poisoned, and of course they couldn't spread south. If you imagine this reintroduction happened on the Black Isle, and then when you look south of the Black Isle, you've got about 60 or 70 miles of grouse moor all the way down to Perth, or more than that, it's 100 miles of keepered grouse moor estate, and they could not penetrate that. It was like the Berlin Wall, you couldn't get past it, They couldn't get it past it. They were spreading north, they were heading up, and they were spreading west as well, but they couldn't get past this, and they were just getting taken out. And I just so I did a couple of sort of internal papers which looked at that specifically, and I said, if you decide to quit funding at the moment, and of course I had introduced wing tagging or continued the wing tagging on red kites. That was important because the wing tagging again showed us, when they entered the breeding population, they showed us what percentage, and because each bird had a year code, so a colour on one wing would tell us what year it was from, with an individual alphanumeric number on it. It could tell us the individual, it could tell us how old the bird was. It could tell us, so we knew how many birds were being wing tagged a year. We knew roughly how many young were being produced. And from that, we could predict how many should be breeding at, say, 2 years old, and how many there were. So we're looking at the loss rate, and we're also monitoring their communal roosts, where, and reading tags there. So we're looking, so first year survival was very good. Like it was phenomenal. It was something like near, 95%. Yep. They were getting through their first winter, no problem whatsoever. But in their first summer, when they're 1 year old, the breeding behavior of the adults forced them out. We don't mind you here during the winter, but now I'm breeding in this winding hoppet. And of course, these disperse into areas where there are no red kites, and there's no red kites in these areas for an obvious reason. Yeah. And then this is where they're getting hammered. So the loss rate between winter 1 and winter 2 was very high. They were just getting hammered in their first summer. And so there was something less than 5% entering the breeding population. And that barely kept up with adult mortality. And this is why the population was static. So I said, made the case to S&H that you can't stop funding this because this is the only handle you've got on what's happening currently, on keepered estates. This is the only handle. No other wing tagging large scale, because we were trying to wing tag the whole of the productivity every year, all the youngest, this is the only handle. And so it ran on. It ran on until it should have finished way back at about 2000, but it ran on until about 2016. Yeah. And then I think the funding finally ran out. I think S&H were getting the squeeze, and they had to look at all their budgets and I had reached 70, and so I just had said, well, it must be time for me to go now. So that's it. So So that's it. 2016, I finally retired full time. So here I am.
Well, I know for a fact the retirement, you're not retired. There's no such thing as retirement for you, Brian.
No, not at all. No. So thankfully, I'm now back being obsessed by hen harriers.
Yeah.
So I've picked up a little bit of contract work, both from the RSPB Life project, which ran up until last year, which was a 5-year study, which involved fitting satellite transmitters, and I picked up a bit of work from the Heads Up for Harrier as one of their field officers. And this is a rather bit of controversial, and I know if Ruth is out there listening to this, she'd be going, "Oh, groan, Brian. I like you, Brian, but I don't like you doing this." So it's rather controversial, is that this is the SNH, or the Scottish Government, trying to work with the states, particularly driven grouse moors, to allow us to put cameras on grouse on hen harrier nests to see what the impact is, what survival is. And they sign up for this, and so I've been doing that for the last 5 years. It's only, for half a dozen days a year or so, but it involves putting out trail cameras, trying to work with landowners. So it's been successful on estates which are not driven grouse moors. But although there's quite a lot of driven grouse moors signed up to it, we're not getting any noticeable impact at the moment.
Right. Yeah.
And the way I see it, I mean, at the moment, the pressure on driven grouse moors is building and building and building, almost by the day. They have, and to me, this is they're in the last chance saloon now. They've got to. If they think they can carry on the way they have been carrying on for the last, particularly the way they have since the late 90s, this really zero tolerance, intense persecution, it's got to stop. And it's no use blaming what us animal rights people, for whatever word, they brought it on themselves. They don't realize there's something like, over 300 Raptor workers out there, and they've known what's been going on for a long, long time, What we may not know the true scale of it, but we've got a darn good inkling how, the scale of it. And, it has to change because, I've lived with this from that very first sparrowhawk, which I found nailed to the gamekeeper's hut.
Yeah.
I can name the estate in case there's any Northumbrian people. It was Blagdon Estate, just up the A9 from Newcastle, and it was in a remote bit of woodland. And this, at the time, sparrowhawks were, really scarce in the early, and this one had been nailed to the side of his shed, along with a load of magpies and crows, of course.
Yeah.
So those days have gone, and now the days of killing every bird of prey that comes on your own grouse moor has got to stop because But at the moment, no sign. But
someone who's spent so much time out on out on the hill. So you spent so many hours, days, years out on the hill. What do you think is going to be is the best step? Because you've almost got two calls for regulation or an outright ban on grouse shooting, or to take it further. Some people say shooting, but if we say grouse shooting, what's your opinion?
Oh, good. That put me on the spot.
Sorry. Do you think regulation would work? Do you think would regulation work in your opinion?
I don't know. It might, if they had infrastructure in there to monitor it. But, you know, this is why we have this problem, because, and let's call it an industry. Grouse shooting is an industry. It's not a sport. It's an industry that is completely unregulated, you know, and self-regulation has not worked, you know. And, you know, they're churning out these young keepers from these rural colleges, you know, who've done their gamekeeping course. And it's like sending them to Borstal. They come out worse than what they went in. They learn out all the worst practices. Yeah. And it really needs.
Yeah.
I'm always amazed, because you would have thought in any other profession or vocation that where there's a lot of illegal activity, there'll be some people who want to play it straight and would stand up and say, "I've had enough of this."
Yeah,
but there hasn't been, and this is the remarkable thing, that there's a lot of them out there moaning and saying and putting out their propaganda, and they've got a very good propaganda machine, you know, and they've got massive funding, you know, from the landowners. But most of it's based just on lies. So I just don't think there's any chance, really, because they're just, or if there is, I think they'll blow it. If we gave them that chance, you know, bring in some regulations, licensing, they'll just blow it. Yeah. Because, the pressure on them, I can call it pressure if I wish. The expectation on these big days where they want to shoot lots of birds, that's what it is. And that's coming from the sporting agents, you know, who are selling the shooting, or from the owner itself, you know, who wants to impress his pals, you know. They all look back 100 years when they could go and shoot 500 brace, you know. These obscene figures that you look at, you know, and those days will never come back. They will never come back. And yeah, I'm inclined. I mean, I used to say when I was doing the hen harrier study, is that I was very strongly against grouse shooting then. I used to say this is the government's either got to say, right, this industry, the grouse shooting industry, is important for the economy, therefore we're going to allow them to kill birds of prey. Now, if they said that, there's nothing you could do about it. And so, you know, you're basically like saying, right, we don't mind you speeding on motorways. There's no speed limit on the motorway. You can go as fast as you like.
Yeah.
That way you don't have any problem about catching people speeding on motorways. Yeah. This way you don't have any problem with persecution, people killing because they're allowed to kill what they like and do what they like. Yeah. But at the moment, and we've got a law that protects these birds. They're particularly vulnerable. As we're seeing what's happening down in England, what's happening probably even now as we talk here in Scotland, you know. Yeah. And it annoys me to hell that we've got laws that are just being flouted, you know. Yeah. It just.
Well, and yeah, I think the thing is as well that a lot of people maybe tuning into this have got to understand as well is because you're on the front line. You see it firsthand, don't you? You know, you're out there on the moor. You're monitoring APAIR, for instance, and then something happens. You know, persecution, and that's it. You know it's happening, and it's just another nest. It's another thing that's occurred when it shouldn't be. It should be, you know, people should be brought to justice over it. So.
And so, So regarding grouse wolves, I mean, I would. I can't see the government ever banning it. They would bring in regulation. They would make all these steps, you know, before they ever bring in, you know, they would bring in licensing, and then they would bring in restrictions, and then they would be wanting to know bag quotas. Yeah. Unfortunately, like a lot of things that are leftovers from the Victorian era, it's often very difficult to get rid of them, you know? But yeah, I mean, if I was to say to you, and many people have said this, will probably say this, if I came to you now, we didn't have grouse shooting, and say, hey, I've got a great idea. See that lovely bit of moorland up there? I'm going to burn it, get the grouse numbers back, and then I'm going to have lots of people stood in holes in the ground, and then I'm going to have lots of other people chasing them in the air, so these other people in the holes in the ground can shoot them. How's that for an industry? And you wouldn't get planning permission for it at all. They would just tell you to F off, you know? Because it's just, they would just say, oh, well, what about this? What about that? But at the moment, all of us have grown up with this almost romance about grouse shooting, you know, the glorious 12th. You know, I grew up with that. I just accepted it as that's the norm. That's what happens, you know. And
yeah, well, I can absolutely agree with you wholeheartedly there. I've got friends even in the lowlands, obviously where I am, and that go shooting, and they go to big estate shooting. And I remember only last year being in the pub with a few of my friends from nothing to do with shooting, but they'd been on a shoot somewhere, and they'd shot over 200 ducks in one drive. And I sat there at the table and I said to my friend, I won't name him, and I said, do you think that's like ethical? Do you think? And he was like, no, to be honest with you, I stopped shooting because there was just too many ducks. You know, it just got a bit silly. And I was like, what goes through your head then?
Yeah, I know.
Birds being shot in.
I think I've said the same feeling. I was once present when they were doing some duck shooting, and they had this. It was a moorland pond, you know, where they'd be putting out loads of ducks. So they had all these tame ducks, and they used to go up every day and put out all the grain for them. It all used to swim in a big flock and eat the grain. And of course, they're so hefted onto this pool, they never want to leave it. Yeah, then one day they come along and they make a racket, force them into the eye, and they fly around in a big circle over the pool, and the guns just shoot away at them. And after the keeper figures they've shot enough, he blows a whistle and they all stop, and the ducks land back on the pond again. Well, what remains of them, you know? And that is sport. I thought this is stupid.
I'm exactly the same with, you know, I've heard it with pheasant shoots. I remember listening to a gamekeeper explain to a bunch of a big football club executives, never shot before in their lives, and this was a day out for them, which I thought was ludicrous. And I happened to be present in the venue where they were talking about it. And he was explaining how they basically they imprint the pheasants to walk up to the top of the hill for food. And then they do that while they're poults and youngsters. And then eventually, without the pheasants knowing, sorry, I don't mean to answer as if they stick a load of guns in between them. So then they scare the pheasants off and people shoot them. And you think, how does anyone think this is normal in our world? You know, and hunters. Anyway, we've got, I can't neglect, because obviously I keep an eye on time. We've got some questions that come in. A few people have said hello. And Andrea Goddard said hello, and Mike Price, and a few others. So,
guys,
I'll ask Andrews in a minute. Someone's asked, Ian's asked, just a quick answer. What's your opinion on red kite feeding stations with all the work you've done on red kites? Are they still worthwhile, or are they more of a tourist attraction rather than a benefit to kites?
Well, certainly in the beginning they were very important, because it's and I visited quite a few, and I thought I remember took on my way on my summer holidays down to Devon, where my folk come from, you know. We stopped off at Giggering, if you can imagine going via Giggering to get to Devon to see it there. And I was just blown away. I'd just never seen such a spectacle in all my life. And I just saw that, you know, all those people, I thought, this is just brilliant. You know, there was over 200 people there. This amazing experience of seeing large numbers of raptors. And yeah, I suppose at the very beginning it got red kites into the people's heads, and then when they saw their own one flying over their own house, they were excited, and I still get great pleasure seeing red kites about on the Black Isle, see them over my house, even when I go out on the moors, you see them over the moors. And yeah, I still think there's a positive side. So there's the public relation side of things. Show them red kites. Yeah. And there's also, you're giving them good, clean food. So you're enhancing first year survival, because a lot of the birds that attend these are immature non-breeders, So it ensures that they're spending time with good, clean food. And they're not going out into dangerous areas. Yeah, I know there could be a counter argument, That's, I'm happy with them. I'm happy with it, and I'm happy with the continuation of them as well.
Yeah.
As long as it's just small amounts and it's just done, at a fixed time. I think 2 o'clock is the agreed time,
Good. Okay. Yeah, I agree. I think the public engagement aspect of it's got kind of huge weight. Yeah, it's really, really important side of things. Andrew Goddard's asked a question. It's quite a big question, so in a nice way. So I don't know how you'd even. I got told off for asking a similar question to a couple of people we've had on this. What is your best raptor memory, and your worst? As well, but I suppose you've kind of mentioned your worst one in many ways is the sparrowhawk on the shed.
No, that wasn't worst.
Oh right, go on. We'll quickly give us the worst and your best then. If you
I don't know. I mean, if you'd tried me, at the time I was 14 or 15 or something like that, and I was obsessed with dead birds. I used to be on my bicycle, so I'd pick up dead birds off the road, have their wings all cut out and pinned up with a label on it, and oh hey, I've got a sparrowhawk wing, got a skull. My mum used to pull her hair out of the dead things I had, so that wasn't the worst thing. Gosh, the best thing. Yeah, there's been a few. I mean, I suppose what was finding probably the most exciting was finding a black kite nesting in my red kite population. That was, and tracking down the nest, that was really exciting. That just gave me such a buzz, because I just thought I'm quite proud of the detective work I did. I knew this, he came up for about 3 years, and I didn't cotton on what he was up to, until about the 30th. And I thought, this bird is picking up food. He came into this field that was being cut for hay, and he picked up this chopped up pheasant or whatever it was, and flew direct. He was heading somewhere, and he went out of sight. So I went and positioned myself, a couple of kilometers away, and just sat down there. And then, sure enough, after a couple of hours, he's coming back the way. And I thought, well, I'm going to stay. And then, sure enough, another hour, so he's back going the same route. And then I moved on for another couple of kilometers, and eventually located the nest. And he was breeding with a red kite, a female red kite, and actually climbing up to that nest and seeing these 3 young, which to me just looked like red kites.
Yeah.
But he was a black kite. Definitely, he was just so distinctive. He had a very. In fact, I had to get somebody. I remember. I think I took Roy Dennis to it, and Eric Mead came down from Auckland to see it, because Eric is another of my old school pals from my Northumberland days, So I needed these guys to say, I'm not imagining it, but I was quite proud of that. It was a real buzz day, I was really on a high. So bad day. Oh God. Yes, well, it would have to be the big red kite poisoning incident that we had on the Black Isle back in 2010. And I was nearing the end then. At the time I thought they're just going to run out of funding, and we're nearing the end. And I thought, I've just spent bloody 15 years of my bloody life working on this research, and some idiot has gone out there and carpeted this area with poison in the spring and killed all these breeding red kites, you know. And it was just for a few days, it was so dark. And I knew exactly where to look. I could just go to the nest sites, you know, and there'd be dead birds on the nest. There'd be dead birds lying on the ground below it. I was steaming. It was, yeah, I was on a really low. You know, we'd had poisoning incidents all through my years as a red kite officer, but it'd be just 1 or 2 a year. And of course, we were just looking at what was happening really in the core area. We'd no idea what was happening out. But yeah, that, and it went international as well. And it was well, even when I think back now, it's painful, you know, because it really was a turmoil for me.
All right, well, just to cheer you up quickly then, do you still, a question from me that sort of relates to this, do you still get the same enjoyment and pleasure, excitement when you see a hen harrier male?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. My hair stands on my head. When I see my first my first male come in, you know, in the spring, I'll go to I've got a study area up in Sutherland. It's an area that's never been kept, never been burnt. And I can say so since our first located bears breeding there back in the late 80s, I've been there every year, and every year there's been at least one breeding pair, continuous, you know. And so that's where I want my fix. I need my male hen harrier fix. I have to go and get it, and just my hair goes, oh, there it is. Oh, yes. Oh, Jesus God. As they say, it's that first male of the spring is better in sex, you know, as they.
Yeah, well, I've said things similar, but yeah.
Oh, it is just brilliant.
I'm keeping it on the time, but there's loads of things we still need to talk about. Let's quickly, well, I keep saying quickly, let's talk about the Scottish Raptor study groups, because they have been such a big part of your life as well. I'm very proud to be a southerner that's been welcomed into the Highland Raptor study group. I'm a foreigner, and the few meetings that I've been to and the involvement I've had with you and other people that I've met through it has been fantastic. It's nothing short of amazing, except for the time I nearly died when I slept in my van near near Leg, and it was February and I only had my dog to keep me warm. That was a bad move. Anyway, but otherwise, just tell us a little bit about your involvement with the Raptor study groups, their importance, if you can even put that into words.
Oh, yeah, very extremely important Scottish Raptor study groups, and very well organised now. So there, I think we've got 12, I think, regional Raptor study groups, virtually going from Shetland, Orkney, the Western Isles, Lewis and Harris, and then all the mainland divided up, Highland, and so they all got elected chairs, treasurers, secretaries, what have you, and a very number of members. So it can be as small as, I think, probably half a dozen out on Lewis and Harris, or, you know, in Highland we've got something over 70, and so that, and within the Raptor study groups you've got people who want to look at buzzards, you've got some who focus purely on owls, barn owls, tawny owls, you've got merlin men, you've got a lot of eagle men in Highland. Well, we've got the biggest eagle population, you know. So, and we've got a few harrier men as well, and you've got general ones and people who just want to look at all of them, you know, as many as they can. And you've got, I suppose, in every Raptor group there's a proportion who are just can't do very much field work, but they're supporters and they're there, you know, in number supporting, you know.
Could you just, I'm going to use this as a way of sort of possibly highlighting how important the Raptor study groups has been, and maybe a feather in the cap, but also it's because you've been heavily involved in this. I've got a book here, Brian. Can you see what I'm holding up?
All right.
Yeah.
Yes, that looks familiar.
Now, obviously, a huge amount of work for anyone who hasn't got this book. They need for me, this is the Bible really for Raptor monitoring. I've got, yeah, this is the second edition. Obviously, you're on there as one of the co-authors. There we go. That the Scottish Raptor study group played a huge part in the development and the creation of this book. And is it fair to say that this is a great example of why the Raptor study group?
Yeah, well, I mean, the lead author there, the late John Hardy, he was very important within the North East Scotland Raptor study group. Known John right from the very beginning. Yeah, and all the other authors are members of Raptor study groups, you know.
Yeah.
So, yep, hugely important. And I think that was quite an important getting that out, because that was a big thing to bring us all together. And there were lots of drafts, so it went out to the various experts, and then I think there's been 3 printings, and each time we've incorporated new data. And hey, I wish to heck we had something like that when I was starting off. When I started off really seriously looking at sparrowhawks back in the mid-70s, the only one thing we had was the British Birds of Prey by
Leslie Brown.
Leslie Brown, of course.
Yes, yeah.
I devoured that book.
Yeah.
It was just amazing. Just love it. I still love it. I still go back to it, even though it's out of date. I just love it, and that's all I had.
Well, the thing I love about talking to you, Brian, is though before when you were talking at the start of this, you were doing some serious name dropping. I know some people watching this might not know. You know, Mick I don't know some of these people personally, but Mick Marquis, I know you know, Roy Dennis, Ian Newton. It's, you know, so. And
well, they all had a big impact on me. Well, of course, Mick, you know. Yeah, we knew we're in short trousers. We did all cycling in those early days in Northumberland, you know. Yeah. We grew up together as teenagers. So so he's a personal friend, Mick. And so he was a major influence. And I think knowing Mick on that period during the 70s when raptors were increasing, coming out of all that pesticide era, you know, and knowing, you know, and there was a great deal of excitement, you know. And there was, you know, colleagues down in Northumberland, like Eric Meek and Brian Little, and we were exchanging ideas. We're on the phone, and I would go down to Northumberland for big weekends, and it was just so important, you know. And of course we were in our 20s then. It was exciting time. Your Raptors were bouncing back, you know, and.
Well, I'm glad we have people like you recording it.
But now this is what gets often thrown at us. What's the matter with it? How many Raptors do you want? You know, this is what I've had thrown at me. You know, how many Raptors do you want? Which obviously comes from the other side. And my response is, well, how many bloody red grouse do you need? You know, how many pheasants do you need? How many red-legged partridges do you need?
Well, that's true. Yeah, we did mention that last night with Ruth Tingy about some of the propaganda that, you know, there's the one. I think it was GWCT was saying there's over 250,000 raptors now. They're booming, and I was like, well, and Ruth said, and I agreed. You know, you can't package them all up into one figure.
No,
it doesn't work like that. Just because buzzards are successful in one area, merlins are in dire straits in a lot of areas.
I know. Yeah, and you can go to large areas of Britain where you just don't see any birds of prey at all.
Yeah. So anyway, back to a couple more questions have come up. Gareth's asked, do you think, it's going back to us sort of shooting in the States, sorry, do you think walked up estates are more accepting of raptors? Is the issue intensification of shooting?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. I think they are walked up. Well, I mean, mainly because they don't tend to have anyone employed full time
Right.
So they might have a low ground keeper, and they'll do a few days walk up. You know, they will just take the dogs out and just more or less to really go for the exercise and the pleasure of working the dog. And if they shoot a couple of brace, you know, that's perfect. They're not really interested, and so they're not up on the hill during the spring and summer.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a number of estates that I look at with heads up harrier do walk up, and they have harriers and they get away with it. It's what I would class as unmanaged moorland. I mean, occasionally they do burn, but it's not the sort of small regulated. They just sort of think, oh, the heather's getting a bit long, and they'll just put a match to that hillside, you know, something like that. But it's never serious stuff, and there's never any persecution. So I can tolerate walk up, and that's really very close to wildfowling, you know, the traditional wildfowling where the guy sort of, you know, goes to the local marsh or whatever, and maybe he's quite happy to get a couple of duck for the pot, you know, and maybe it's a goose, sustainable.
Yeah.
Okay. So I've no problem walked up, and I think that's the answer, you know.
Now, while I've got you on as well, because I've mentioned the book, Field Guide for Surveys and Monitoring, and you've talked about a bit about the Scottish Raptor groups. I'm well aware that every year you run a couple of days for people like me to come and learn from people like you know, people with a lot more experience. So you do a woodland one and a moorland one. What do you find is a really important attribute to have if you're into raptor monitoring, or you want to get into raptor monitoring? Or could it be anyone? Well, it can be anyone, of course. What do you think is an important attribute to have?
Oh, it's a good one. Well, I think you need to have a passion for being outdoors. The ability to really enjoy your own company, you know, the ability to sit on your backside for a long period of time and just do nothing and just watch, that sort of appreciation, you know. Yeah, I mean, I go out with other people occasionally, you know, so I quite enjoy it, but I don't like two's fine.
Yeah.
And I must admit, there are some people who come on the courses that they just want to come along for a chat, and I just keep cringing, looking back at them and saying, just shut up and just watch, and you're not here to blether away and talk about whatever, you know, save that for the car, you know. Yeah. And so so that ability, and I really enjoy it. I think they're important, because going right back to dear old Mick, he spent time with me in those early years, you know, and I learned from him very quickly, you know, and I've learned from lots of other people over the years, you know, the individual hen harrier guys down in southwest Scotland who started me off really seriously. Just brilliant, those early days. So people spent time with me, and I think it's important that us I'm about to say old farts there, but you know what I mean, as older generations spend time with other people, passing on the knowledge that we have. Because when I go to Raptor conferences, I think every time I look there, we get whiter and grayer, and there's, you know, I want to see younger people in there, you know. Where are these young folk, you know? It seems like there's a whole generation of us from the you know 60s all together, and we're not passing our information on to, you know, younger people.
Well, the book's a good start, and I can only testify. You know yourself. You'd never heard of me before. Luckily, obviously, I was a mutual friend of ours, Steve Roberts, put us in touch. But you were brilliant with me. This lad who you'd never heard of before, and you met me. I remember meeting you in the cafe and us poring over Ordnance Survey maps. So, but it's important because, you know, putting people on the right
Well, the fact is, when you told me that you're coming up in your van in February to go and monitor an eagle site that nobody's been on the lookout for about 10 years, I thought, well, you must be keen to drive all that way to get near frozen to death. So my respect for that.
I enjoyed it. Yeah, no, it's well worth it anyway. The scenery that I get to look at isn't too bad as well.
Yeah, well, it's about time you came back again, Jimmy. That don't think those sites have been looked at since you last up 2 years ago.
I know. Yeah, I will. I had my wings clipped a bit, but
I think we've all had our wings clipped with this lockdown at the moment. Go.
Yeah.
Apart from our friends in England, they're okay apparently. But,
I know. Well, without sort of talking amongst ourselves, I know tomorrow's a big day for. I'm in Wales as well, so yeah, find out what's going on tomorrow in Wales. But anyway, someone's asked another question, a bit of a curveball one. Have you ever come across hen harriers crossbreeding with Montague Harrier?
No, I haven't. No. Of course, I'm aware of the Pallid Harrier case in Orkney, and I had experience with a Pallid Harrier down in Perthshire way back in the early 90s in the breeding season. It probably attempted to breed, but it attempted to breed on a grouse moor. So almost certainly it was there for about a week. It was displaying. But certainly the pairs of hen harrier that were there all got done in, so almost certainly he would have got done in, and the keeper wouldn't have known the difference between the two. Yeah. So that's the only my experience. I've never, but I think you shouldn't. Everything's possible. So the two species are very similar, and on the continent where hen harriers are breeding in cereal fields, and Montagues of course are as well. Yeah, it's possible if a black kite can come all the way to the Highlands, get lost and decide, oh, this is nice, go away for the winter and then come back the next year and do that 3 times, and breed. Yeah. So anything's possible.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, yeah, absolutely. Anything's possible.
But no, I've no experience of that, and I don't think we would see it in Scotland. So because Montagues are so scarce now.
Yeah, well, of course, yeah, absolutely. And what's then, just to finish up, because I'm conscious of time, we've well smashed the 1 hour mark, Brian.
Oh, wow.
So thank you very much for your time. No, it's good. What's the Thursday tomorrow? Fingers crossed, you're allowed to go out and stretch your legs. What's going to be first on Brian Etheridge's list of things to look at? Obviously, not too much detail, but what species or what?
Well, I thought I would start in a small way, and go and look at all my local osprey eyries to see if the birds are back. Just warm to it. Nice. So I thought I'd whiz around those.
Brilliant. Yeah, I'm starting in a small way because I'm going to go look around my little owl boxes.
Oh, right.
Because they're all relatively.
Oh, I used to look at little owls in my Northumberland days. Great favourite of mine.
I've got I've got a nice little pocket of little owl boxes.
I miss little owls. I would really like to have them. Maybe when you come to the Highlands, you could bring some with you.
Yeah, do another
start another reintroduction, little owls.
Yeah, little owls. Yeah, okay, brilliant. Right, well, I'm not gonna keep you any longer, Brian, because okay. I'm really grateful for your time. I hope that hasn't been too painful for you.
I've quite enjoyed it. It's a good old blether. It's
good. That's what we like. Go on. I was going to say it's a good my nickname for you. So I have a nickname for people. So I've got Steve Roberts, for instance, obviously famous for his honey buzzards and being Welsh through and through. He's the Welsh wizard. He's known as the Welsh wizard. Steve is. But we have a little chat group. Me, Ashley Smith, and a few others. Steve Bentle, a few others. And you're known as, I call you God, by the way, so you're known as God to us. So yeah, and definitely from what you've told us tonight, all the work you do.
Don't call me big.
That's not age related, by the way. Before you think, oh, charming. It's knowledge.
That's a bit crazy, that is.
Anyway, right, I'll say goodbye to everyone for us.
Yeah,
Thank you very much, Brian.
Yeah, and cheerio to everyone who's listening. I hope that I haven't spoilt your impression of me.
Cheers, Brian.